I'm Charlene Jorgensen and welcome to Quilting from the Heartland. Thank you for giving us the opportunity to once again come into your homes for the 10th series. We're really fortunate at Quilting from the Heartland because we are 3 generations of quilters working together. My granddaughter Brittany, who is 13, her mother Angela, and myself. We all have something a little different to offer, so we're sure that there will be something for everyone. We have a real nice lineup of programs in this series. We have hand applique, machine quilting, hand quilting. We'll be making some Christmas ornaments. Just a real nice variety, so make sure that you can tune in every week to see what's new. Today I'm going to start out the 10th series with the glorified 9-patch. This is one of my favorite all-time quilt patterns. It's a great quilt to use up scraps in, and the first one that I'm going to show you was done with a collection of fabrics called the Aunt Grace's collection. This is a special collection to me because it reminds me so much of the fabrics that Grandma had in her aprons. It looks very scrappy, however I used all new fabrics from the collection, and if you look closely you'll see that the same fabrics are used twice in the same quilt, just using them in a different position in each of the 9 patches. The last fabric that I choose when making the glorified 9 patch is always the fabric that's used in the melons to connect them together. The next version of the glorified 9 patch that I'm showing you is my patriotic one, and for this one I really had only scraps to work with, and so what I did was I sewed all of my red, white, and blue fabrics together into strips and then made the 9 patches before choosing again the fabric that goes into the melons. The one that I'm working on today was a little bit easier to choose the fabric for because Benetech sent me a collection of fabric that just came out this spring. When you look closely at the quilt, you'll notice that there is a high contrast between the fabrics used in the 9 patch. It's very important that you do that so that they don't mush together. There is a wide range of colors in the quilt. They all have the same mood. And again, like in the other 9 patches, I chose the fabric for the melons last. This one has a different ending than the rest of them, and if you look closely at the quilting, there are concentric circles quilted around that center square, which gives it a different look in the end. Well, now let's take a look at the fabric closer up at the table, and let me show you what some of your different options are when putting your quilt together. I mentioned earlier that you want to have a high contrast between the pieces that you put together. This floral would look real nice with either one of these, either the plaid or the stripe. If you take a look at this fabric, it would look real nice with the check or with the brick one. So you can mix and match your different fabrics and use them in different ways throughout the quilt. I won't go through all the fabrics in that way, but you'll have a lot of fun putting your fabrics together for your 9 patches. And like I said, the last fabric that I chose was the fabric that goes into the melons. When working with this design, there are only 2 pattern shapes that you need to work with in making the glorified 9 patch. It is the template from the background of the double wedding ring and the add-on melon to the double wedding ring. To save time today, I have already pre-sewn some of the strips together that are going to be used in the glorified 9 patch. These are, the red strip or the wider strip is 4.5 inches wide, and the narrow strip in the center is 2.5 inches wide. You make 2 combinations of strips, alternating the colors in your combinations. After you have done that, then you press the seams open, and when I press the seams open, I always finger press, separating the fabric so that you don't have wells in your seam line, and then press it with steam. After I have sewn the strips together and I have my two combinations of strips, then I will cut them a second time. The first one that I cut will be a 4.5-inch strip going in this direction. So we'll move over the ruler to the 4.5-inch mark and we'll line that up with the straightened edge of the fabric, and then we'll also line up the center of the sewn strip with one of the lines on the ruler, and then we will cut that strip off. And for each 9 patch you need 2 4.5-inch strips. Again, lining up the line on the ruler with the seam line, and you will have 2 that look like this. Then from the other combination of strips, you need to cut a piece 2.5 inches wide, and again line up this line on the ruler with the seam line down the center, and cut a 2.5-inch strip. Now if you'll notice, this combination that I cut is different from the one over here, and what I will end up with when they're sewn together is the one like the one down below. Now when sewing these together, and I'll sew one of these 9 patches together for you at the sewing machine, after these are sewn together you'll have a piece like this, and if you sew these together you'll have a combination that looks like that. Now to cut this out, this is the most exciting part about this design. Everybody thinks this is so difficult, but what I have done is I have scored my template through the center, and these score lines are 2 inches apart. I will match those lines up with the patchwork. That way every single glorified 9 patch will be exactly the same, and you just follow the edge of the template, cutting around it. And now all these unusual shaped pieces will be cut accurately. They'll all be the same, instead of piecing all these unusual shapes together to make the uneven 9 patch. Make sure you don't disturb your background piece before you cut it. Also notice that I have put fabric grips on the back side, which helps keep it from sliding around. Also, I might mention that I like to use the small cutter whenever I'm working with curves. Now I have completed the cutting of one of the glorified 9 patches used in this quilt. The waste is so little that the time you've saved doing it is definitely going to make the waste worthwhile. The next part is to cut out the melons, and ahead of time, to save time, I have pre-cut strips to accommodate the width of the template, and then I'm going to fold that in half again, so I now will have 4 thicknesses of fabric. Lay the melon down on top of those 4 layers of fabric, and we will get 4 of those at a time. If you work on a small mat board, it makes it so much easier, so you can turn your work as you're cutting around the template, instead of walking around the table like we sometimes do because we forget to turn our board. We need to cut just a little bit more, and we now have 4 melons identical to each other to go into the glorified 9 patch. I won't take the time now to cut the mirror image of that one, but you will just lay your template down again, find the center, and cut around it. and you will have from the same two fabrics, two glorified 9 patches with the same fabrics, but you can put them in a different position in the quilt. Well, now I think we've shown you enough about the cutting, and we will take you to the sewing machine and put these together. I will sew all of the seams with a scant 1/4 inch seam allowance, and I will use cotton thread to match the fabric for content as well as strength. The first thing I'm going to show you how to do is to match the seams on the uneven 9 patch. Like I mentioned earlier, all of the seams are pressed open, and what I want you to do to get perfect intersections is to insert the pin right on the seam line 1/4 of an inch from the top and the bottom. This is one of the ways that you can match the intersections. And then insert a pin on one side, or the side that goes under your presser foot first. The other method that I like to use, and this one I probably use them equally as much. Notice how I've flipped the bottom fabric one direction and the top fabric in the other direction. I will snug it up until the ridges match each other, and then I will send them both back in the same direction and put a pin along the seam line, and then let this seam allowance come forward. And that pin will stay in there while we sew across that seam line. Always start sewing on an anchor cloth. That way your beginning stitches will be as strong as the center stitches on your seam. Slow down when you approach the pin. This sewing machine has a pressure sensitive foot, so when it comes to the pins it knows when to lift the foot up, which is something that is really a nice feature to have. Now sew onto an anchor cloth, and this seam will be ready to press open. See how nice both of those intersections match. Two different ideas to get to the same result. Okay, I won't sew the other one on, but I wanted to show you two different ways to put that together. Now we need to identify the center of our glorified 9 patch. To do that, fold it in half and cut a little tiny notch on all 4 sides. This will mark the center, and make sure that you don't go so deep that you go into the seam line. Now when working with this curve, I'm not going to clip anything or ease anything because they were drafted to match perfectly. And I think I forgot to point out in the beginning that all the seam allowance is included in all the pattern shapes. So you don't need to add that when you're cutting. Now to find the middle of the melon, you'll fold it in half and also cut a little tiny notch on both sides. Now right sides together, sew with the smile or the concave on top. Insert a pin in the middle to match that, and then go to the end and put a pin 1/4 of an inch through the end, through the top and the bottom. Now when we sew this seam, we will be back stitching to each end, which is something that I don't very often do. Insert the pin 1/4 of an inch, which is an equal distance from all 3 sides of the tail, and 1/4 of an inch from the edge of the melon. Now when I sew this seam, I will not clip anything. I'll probably insert one more pin in the center, and we'll do the same over here. We'll just use one more, and the rest we will do the pinning with the stiletto as we sew. Now I will back stitch up to the point that the pin went into the fabric, and then we'll continue sewing forward and doing the rest of the pinning with the stiletto, making sure that both edges of the fabric are perfectly matched up. Otherwise you don't end up with a nice curve in your patchwork. I'm sewing with a brighter color thread so that you can see easily what I'm doing. After you've learned how to put the melon on, the whole design is completed the same way. You just keep adding 9 patches and melons until the quilt is the size that you want it to be. Before I start actually laying out my whole quilt, I would probably take all of the 9 patches and lay them out on a bed sheet and pin them down so that I have a mix of fabric so that you can put the reds in different parts, for example. You don't want them all in the same part of the quilt. Back up, and we will be ready to add the next melon. To cut the thread, I don't have to use a scissor. I just push the button on the machine and my thread is cut for me. Now to press the seam allowance on this, I will press it towards the melon. See how nicely, actually the fabric wants to go in that direction. And then I would take the time to press it with some steam. And we'll be ready to add the next melon. See how easy that was? I didn't have to do any clipping or easing to add it to the quilt. Now we will just continue to add more melons. Got to remember to cut those little notches so that we know where the center point is. And always work with a smile on top. Now when doing this, we'll put it over on this side. I like to sew so that when I sew this seam, I end up or backstitch in the part that connects it to the last melon that I added. If you sew with this on top, I can see where the last seam was made, so I'll end up with that perfect point in the corner. So I'm going to insert my pin right on that thread line in that corner. And then I will go into the melon and pin it down there. Now we'll go back to the other one. We'll insert a pin 1/4 of an inch from the edge there, and same here, and we're ready to sew another seam. We'll just need to put a couple more pins in. Actually, I wouldn't even have to put the pin in, but for security we will. We'll put one more over here. This is an old traditional design. It's not something new to quilting. It's just a new way of putting the design together. Now we'll back up, we'll drop the presser foot, push the reverse, and we'll back up to that pin, stop, and continue ahead and sew that seam. And when I get to the other end, I'll want to stop right where my last seam was sewn, and that's how I will get the perfect corners. Just like any other quilt, the size of the quilt, it just keeps getting bigger and bigger when you add more melons and more 9 patches. The part that's so important in this quilt, and if anybody is going to have problems with this design, is in this very last thing that I'm going to show you. And this is how I get the perfect points in the design. Make sure that you stop that seam right at the point where the last seam ended. So you want those to touch and reverse at that point. Push the button, cut the thread, and you now have one more melon attached. And see how nicely they come together in the corner. Then what you would do is finger press and move that fabric towards the melon. Just keep adding melons to the 9 patches, watch the quilt grow, and you'll have your own beautiful glorified 9 patch.